So welcome again to our workshop, Transformative Strategies on Gender Equality in Trade Unions with our expert Melisa and Werner. Thanks for being here, taking your time. Melisa is a professor in labor studies at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and Werner is a postdoctoral research fellow of the Global Dialogue Program of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Berlin. They wrote the handbook Transformative Strategies Towards Gender Equality in Trade Unions together, which is also the base of Melisa's video lecture. And you can find some abstract of it under additional readings under Melisa's unit in iVersity. Today, both will answer your questions today in the workshop, which is planned for about 1 hour. And as you all know already from other workshops, this will be an interactive workshop again. That means that we count on your active participation in forms of comments and questions. And if you have some comments and questions, feel free to write them in the chat, or even better, raise your hands and ask ask the question directly. And please put your hand down if your question has been answered. So as usual, we're going to start with a question to kickstart the conversation. And after that, you can start asking questions or making comments. And the best would be if you raise your hand and speak directly to our experts, since sometimes it's a little bit hard to understand written questions. So I hope there are no questions, and I would like to kickstart with the first question to Melisa and Werner. So there are lots of discussion from the course participants under your video lecture. Some comments are pointing to the broader determinants of social inequality, such as access to basic life infrastructure, for example, access to water, which we understand goes beyond the scope of the research you did. But please feel free to comment that. Some others are pointing to the importance of networking, which may arguably be a tactic rather than a strategy. Are there examples of gender equality networks across unions? And if so, how do these work? Thank you.
Okay, I will answer this first set of questions. Again, good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining our workshop. So I want to answer the question. Social inequality and gender inequality are inextricably linked. Women are more likely than men to experience social inequality. I mean, many studies have pointed this out. In our handbook, as we discuss in our handbook, in the OECD countries, women spend an average of 4.5 hours per day in unpaid care work, compared to only 2 hours and 30 minutes for men. In my own study of unpaid care work among workers in the informal sector in the Philippines in 2019, I found that women devote between 9 and 12 hours per day of unpaid care work. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this because reproductive work in terms of care work is the most important factor that constrains women's participation in the labor market and their access to secure and income and sustainable jobs. No, motherhood reduces chances of being employed, suggesting the existence of what the ILO calls motherhood employment penalty. So they even concocted this this term. Now, going back directly to the question, I mean to the statement that I need to comment on, providing women access to basic life infrastructure, such as clean and potable water, free and quality health care and education, and affordable and safe housing, among others, significantly reduces the time women devote for reproductive work. It also addresses the slow improvement in the area of shared domestic work across the world. For example, the absence of a potable water facility in the home results in women spending more time fetching water from a public water source in the community, doing laundry, etc. Similarly, lack or limited access to free and quality health care not only increases households' out of pocket expenses for health needs, but also intensifies women's work on caring for children and the elderly. Now, all these suggest that access to basic life infrastructure is therefore an important area for public policy that addresses social inequality and also gender inequality. So that cuts in public spending on public services disproportionately affect women. In our study, we identified legal frameworks which also includes public policies. Among the external factors that influence transformative change towards gender equality in trade unions, many trade unions, particularly in the public sector, have been pushing for laws, regulations, policies aimed at improving and expanding public services and in democratizing the delivery of these services. The second question, examples of gender equality networks across unions and how they work. Again, in our study, networking and coalition building is among the trade union work and activities in and through which transformative change towards gender equality may take place. In addition, um, critical actors and networks, again, are among the external factors that may influence transformational change initiatives of trade unions. Now, our study found that a number of trade unions have built either formal or informal networks with other trade unions in implementing their gender equality programs and projects. Now, these networks may be in the form of collaborative education and training. For example, gender sensitivity training, leadership development for women, in which, or skills training for women, in which women as well as men, union educators of one union, for example, serve as trainers or resource speakers in another union. It can also be in the form of informal exchanges of knowledge, experiences, and strategies. Campaigns for legislations on maternity leave, paternity leave, social protection, quality public services, recognition of unpaid care work, and also the ratification of ILO Convention 190 may also become spaces for trade unions to build networks. In most of these networks, so how do they work? In most of these networks, the usual union structure that coordinates the work is the women's committee of each of the trade unions involved. Federations and confederations in countries, as well as a national trade union from a developed country, may also facilitate the building of networks among enterprise trade unions. So in our study, we provided a recent example, which is the 2019 to 2021 program of the German Trade Union Confederation Education Institute on strengthening women and youth leadership within the trade union movement for decent work. So through this program, participating affiliates from different unions of the ITUC Asia Pacific jointly developed through their women and youth committees a training program and a manual called Way to Go, which is of course also discussed in our handbook. And the program also provided opportunities for the women and youth leaders and members to share good provisions in their collective agreements that address women's needs, such as family welfare, enterprise-based mechanisms addressing violence and harassment at the workplace, provision for a lactation room, even awareness raising on climate change mitigation, and others. Also, a national trade union's affiliation to, for example, ITUC and any of the global union federations may also be considered as a formal and more enduring type of network. In many cases, the support that national and local trade unions get from the global union federations, for example, resulted in the establishment or reactivation of gender equality structures and policies within trade unions. Again, in our handbook, we provided a brief case study of UNI Global Union's Leadership Mentoring Program for Women, which, among others, resulted in the building of a global network of women. Of course, there were also men, gender equality champions. This program also reinforces UNI's 40 for 40 campaign for 40% representation of women in union leadership structures, which is also discussed in our handbook.
Thank you very much for this answer. I think we all should read the handbook. Okay, I would now open the floor for questions and comments of the participants. Are there any questions? I know there is one from Brian. Would you like to ask a question directly to the experts?
Good evening, Dr. Mel and Dr. Verna. Good evening, everyone from the Philippines. Actually, I sort of forgot my question that I inputted in Zoom, but I have another question, if that's okay. So, Prof. Mel and Prof. Verna, what about the partnership of trade unions with gender groups like women's groups or LGBTQ IA plus groups? Is that a possible strategy for transformative action, gender equality, and what are the compatibility and the points of intersection between the two advocacies of work and gender? Is it complementary, or are there conflicts in strategizing the movement of labor and gender? Thank you.
Should I start, Mel? I start.
Please, Binky, answer the question.
I'll start maybe also based from experience working with the trade union movement as well as working with the feminist movements in the Philippines. It was not so long ago, but Brian, you're quite right. There's a lot of complementarity, but there are also tensions. Tensions and contentions within the movement. But we have outlined it in our handbook that this interaction between the trade union movement and other movements, like not only feminist movements, but also human rights movements, youth movement, LGBTQ, because in a struggle, it is needed to have many links with different movements, and they enrich each other. Particularly with on gender equality, based on experience when I was working with the trade union movement, feminist organizations are quite significant in providing a political framework, political and feminist framework that can guide trade union actions in terms of gender. And they were the first to provide education as well. And these are important, which we have outlined in the handbook, that the trade union movement needs to link up with feminist organizations in order to have a more enriching, for example, labor education training or curricula. And then the actions are also well within the struggles of the feminist movement. Now, it is also true that there's a lot of tension and there's a lot of confrontation, especially from the beginning. There were a lot of resistance because when it was in the second wave of feminism in the Philippines, there were a lot of resistance, particularly from the male, because it was a bit threatening and it was a bit confrontational. And that tension still exists today, not as confrontational as before. Before there were really a lot of shouting matches, but now they're more civilized. There are more debates. But I think that's important as for the movements to grow and for the people within that movement to grow. In order for a progressive movement to be more holistic and going forward, these debates need to be undertaken to sharpen ideas about gender equality. What does it mean? What does feminism mean? And what and how and the implications of these to the two networks or the two movements. So far, that's what I can think of, Mel.
Yeah, if yeah, we go back. I go back to our study again to provide a concrete example. In a few of the trade unions from which we interviewed, women leaders, we also found that, many of the women leaders are also members, even officers of feminist organizations. And this may explain to some extent we had the presence of male gender equality champions in for example, in the case of the Philippines, the National Union of Building and Construction Workers, which is, of course, organizing in the construction sector, very male dominated. But then when you see the profile of the women, they are members of a feminist organization. And secondly, trade unions also do partner with civil society organizations in the implementation and the promotion of gender equality. In Cambodia, for example, trade unions develop collaboration with, for example, NGOs that help, in addressing gender-based violence. Because these trade unions do not have the capacity, to address these issues. So again, you see, trade unions reaching out to the community in order to further strengthen, their gender equality programs and projects.
Thank you very much. I found your question, which you had in Zoom, Brian, so I can just read it and then you say if it has been answered, okay? So your question was, how can gender-based groups, for example, women's rights, LGBTQIA plus groups be aligned with union interests? I would say
that's the same question that I asked.
Yeah, so, okay, great. Is there any other question? Or any comments?
There is one in the chat from Sarbeswara.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. Okay. Okay, I will read it out. The last time Sarbeswara had no good internet connection, but I will ask him after reading. How about the gender equality issues of the trans workers, and what's the perception of trade unions? Do you want to say something additionally, Sarbeswara, or is it fine like this?
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah. Great. So thank you for the question. And Melisa and Rena, you can answer.
Binky?
Maybe you can do first. Do the answer first, or I do the introduction. The handbook, we decided we had also a discussion in the handbook whether we will broaden our research to LGBTQ trans workers, but then we decided to just focus particularly to women trade unionists and members However, our discussion of gender equality is quite broad, and it should apply to all segments in the issue of gender. Although we did not discuss about SOGI, SOGI, the sexual orientation, identification, and gender expression, but we include in our framework also the discussion about equality, and it should involve all types of workers in all gender and all sex. And we also discussed about non-discrimination in work and the gender pay gaps, which should not only be binary, it should not only be focused on the binary, although we had more discussion in the handbook about care work that are commonly done by women. Mel?
Well, to tell you frankly, the LGBTQI issues are, relatively new to many trade unions, particularly in Asia, particularly in the developing world in Asia. And I think it is only in recent years that trade unions, I don't know how many years, the trade unions are opening up to the issues of the LGBTQI plus group. And I think trade unions and trade unions and from developed countries and other trade union support organizations are playing a key role, in integrating into the union through their programs, through their support, LGBTQI issues as well. And this, well, in the case, of course, of trade unions in the developing world, in Asia, this even starts, for example, in the case of Cambodia, in trying to, make a database, of the gender profile of their members. So now they are now trying to provide like a non-binary classification, of the gender of trade unions. For example, in a study that I was involved in Cambodia, there was even a question like when you look at the gender classification, there's even a question of self-identified LGBTQI plus groups. So gradually, increasingly, trade unions are now opening up indeed to these issues. And I don't know, we can also ask somebody here from the trade union, Benji Velasco. He was wearing two hats about his experience, particularly from the Workers' Party or Partido ng Manggagawa, Benji. We can have an interactive discussion about the question from Sarbeswara. Okay.
Hi, Mel. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, I just from my first-hand experience of engaging with workers who are organizing, and for example, I'm probably most familiar with workers in the export zones in the Philippines. So, in the garment sector, majority of them, of course, are women, and among them you find I guess a number of workers in lesbian relationships, for example. Although in many cases, union organizing and the demands that they draft usually do not involve gender-related issues, except for, well, not totally absent. For example, in one case, I went to a meeting of workers in an electronics factory, and I was expecting that their grievance would be about pay, but surprisingly, it was about an issue of harassment because the management had dismantle the door to the restroom of women, and I guess there were 90% women in that factory, on the argument that because workers were basically taking too much time in the restrooms. So yeah. But then, yeah, going back to the question of LGBTQ, I know that there were a significant number of workers in lesbian relationships, but they do usually I have not seen like unions, these local unions, integrating these issues into their usual demands, either to management or to the labor department in particular. Yeah. Although I also do know that trade unions have been active in the Philippines in campaigns around women's rights and women's issues. I guess one of the, just to cite a couple, one is the expanded maternity leave campaign in the Philippines, almost doubled the number of mandated leaves for women workers. And then second is what is called the Safe Spaces Act in the Philippines, basically prohibiting harassment of the most common manifestations of gender based harassment of women in public spaces. So I guess it's at different levels, and I guess there's a uneven development among workers and union leaders about appreciating these admittedly new issues like integrating LGBT concerns into trade union demands and trade union work. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to kindly remind you to focus on the topic about gender equality in trade unions. And therefore, I would like to read the next question from Ratnas. Thank you, Melisa, for the clarification. I think this belongs for the answer before. Kindly inspire on the below. Many female workers in Zimbabwe shun to participate in trade union activities. What advice can you share with them? Ratmas, do you want to add some information to that question? Do you hear us?
Thank you, Mira. Where do you want me to clarify?
Or Melisa and Werner, is the question clear, or do you want? Yes. Okay. So thank you, Ratmas, and then Melisa and Werner, please respond.
There is a host of factors that may explain women's lack of motivation to participate in trade union activities. In our study, of course, we identified several of these possible factors. And the main obstacle, or constraint pointed to women's the multiple burden of women, particularly care work, right? So they always say that we cannot participate in union activities because we have to hurry home, we have to cook, we have to take care of the children, we have to take care of everything, of the elderly, not just the children but the elderly as well, etc. And of course, many of the trade unions we interviewed recognize this issue, and part of their gender equality initiatives is to come up with measures that addresses this particular issue. First is one, they adopted a more women-friendly scheduling of activities, of activities. So when is the most convenient time for women, to attend these activities? Secondly, if women are need to attend like trainings for their development, particularly for leadership skills, as we have outlined in our handbook, there are many measures adopted by trade unions, like they can put up facilities for child minding, within, the trade union venue, the activity venue. They can provide like some what we call domestic support allowance, like if there would be somebody that would take care of the children when she's gone, when she goes to union activities, then she gives some money or allowance to this person. It can also be a support money to buy cook food already, so she doesn't need to hurry home to cook food for the children. It can also be other facilities. If the trade union is located in a complex where work, and in this area you also have the factory or the workplace where women work, then the trade union can collaborate or engage or forge partnership with some other organizations to put up like a community daycare center, a public laundry center, etc., etc. But that is just for the aspect of addressing women's care work. But the other issues, such as, like, of course, it's always the family that's the husband holding back women from participating and spending more time, in the trade union by attending trade union activities. Perhaps Verna can continue, because I've been talking too much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll just add that in our study, we've also included that the trade unions, in response to promoting gender equality, is to have gender sensitivity trainings. Or about gender equality, they integrate it in their leadership trainings. And there are men participants in these trainings, but the main topic is that trying to reach men to say that household chores is not a natural role of women. Men can do household chores and should be able to share with women, like washing the dishes, cooking, taking care of the kids. Because in gender equality, if women do all the reproductive work, it also takes away the pleasure from men to care for children, for their caring instinct to be developed. So it takes away from it. And when women are more burdened with household chores, it also takes away their ability to support men to find productive work and contribute in the income of the family. So there are pros and cons. So the idea is domestic work or household work, care work can be done by sharing, which is sharing between men and women, or there should be no gender in the work of, it could be trans women, trans men, or everyone. There's having household chore is not a natural role for women to do. It's just that the natural thing for women is just to be pregnant, which is the biological aspect. So other than that, others are culturally shaped, and these aspects are included in the curriculum on gender sensitivity. Why this is so? Why culture and social beliefs and values have been shaped through history, and then there is gender inequality. So that's one idea. And specifically on your question about in Zimbabwe, We also had in our handbook to look at the context of the situation of women where they are. And there are external and internal factors. External factor can be different from different countries. So the context need to be included. And also in the internal level, how inclusive can trade unions be? How can they evolve to be more inclusive, to inspire women to join? At the same time, look at the political, economic, cultural, and social context where women are there. For example, how the legal frameworks are shaping. Maybe women are more not really allowed to go out because there are also countries with rules. Like for example, in the Philippines before, women were not allowed to work night shift because it's just a belief that it's not safe for women to work night shift. But that has changed through time. So there are different legal frameworks that also prevents women from going to the labor market and joining trade unions. And those have to be considered as external factors and then looked at the internal factors. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any other question?
There
Yes,
was a question
Benjamin.
about gender equality, right? In the first email, Mira. Then gender equality champions.
Sorry?
In the email that you sent, there were two questions. Like one was answered by Mel, and the other was about gender equality champions.
Yeah, I would first give the space for the participants for their questions, and then I would close up the conversation with the last question I sent you in the email, if that's okay. Okay, so Benjamin.
Yeah, so hi again. Well, from the lecture and from the manual written by Mel and Verna, so changes are happening in the trade unions on the question of integrating gender equality. But can you cite maybe even a few would you consider as important ways by which things can still be further improved, or ways by which trade unions can further the process of integrating women's issues in within the trade union movement?
Oh, there's another one from Edlira.
Yeah, if I may, because I think it's somehow connected to Benji's question. I just read this article by Christy Ward on gender regimes and Cambodian labor unions. And I think it's interesting that when it comes to referring to what's the situation of women representation in trade unions, lots of literature is like at least 10 years old, but many things have happened. And as Benji was saying, all this changes seems not to be that much reflected in the literature. So there is almost like this discussion we have had forever, that the trade unions have problems with gender equality and so on. So, but we understand from your research that the situation is a bit more dynamic. And in particular, I would also want for both of you, since you are involved in this discussion with Christy Ward, to elaborate a bit on this, how this gender regimes that the author is discussing, you know, a gender regime in the world of work, in the workplace, a gender regime in the family, and the gender regime within the unions that are you know, interplay with each other and are in some ways also challenging each other, meaning unions getting let's say, a more prominent role in trade unions is actually challenging or disrupting whatever balance of gender regime is there in the workplace or in their own families. So if you could kind of discuss this in terms of what are your findings of how are these actually challenging these other regimes. And I know that the author makes an argument for women to actually be penalized if they are having gains in the trade union leadership, then they are penalized home, but or punished. I think she uses the language of punishment. But I think we could look at it also from a different way of actually challenging and disrupting that whatever balance is in these gender regimes. And perhaps it's not a punishment after all. It may look like a punishment in the short term, but in the longer term, perhaps it's leading to something more positive. And since you did this very extensive research on what unions are doing, I think it would be very interesting if you could shed some light on that. Sorry for the long question.
Okay, I'll try first to answer that. Is that okay with you, Binky? Okay. I'll try to answer first Edlira's question. And in a way, this will also answer the question of Benji. Or I can start with Benji's question. Okay, let's start with Benji because he was the one who asked first. So Benji's asking for, ways on improving further. I think, yes, trade unions have been adopting, a host of measures that are gender equality related, that promote gender equality. But more often, the initiatives are fragmented, fragmented and compartmentalized. Because we are talking here of transformative change. Transformative change occurs over time. So that's why we are emphasizing in our book, complementary, and sustained, use of these strategies through spaces, structures, and institutions. Right. Meaning, like what Brian wrote in his you have this discussion forum, right, in the MOOC, right? That I think he said that. What did you say there, Brian? I forget. That it has to be continuing. What did you say, Brian? Can you share what you said there? It has to be continuing. It has to be complementary. Because of course, for example, you wanted you promote gender equality. You have the quota system. Yeah, I recall now. You have the quota system for leadership representation, but then the trade union does not provide, opportunities for training for women to acquire, leadership skills, not only through training, but of course, practicing what they have learned by involving them in various trade union activities. Which are, let's say, higher level activities, which of course also reflects on the question of Edlira. In the paper of Christy Ward, she talked about 3 gender regimes, women's regimes, meaning when you say regime, you talk about institutions there, you talk about labor control institutions, you talk about relationships, etc. So Christy Ward identified like 3 gender regimes. 1 at home, in the family, 2 at the workplace, and 3 in trade unions, or other organizations. But she focused on trade unions. But she also argued that these gender regimes are, of course, interconnected, and they are interconnected. So there is interplay between and among these gender regimes. And she said, but what is quite intriguing, an intriguing argument that she raised during this is the International Sociological Association Conference for Asia and the Pacific, is that there are also quite, tension, between and among these gender regimes. For example, women's activism in the trade union earned them like a higher profile in the trade union. They're more recognized, and they may also be candidates for, a top leadership position. But then, their activism in the trade union is in a way had an adverse effect, or is being penalized in the gender regime at the workplace, in terms of, if the in terms of, employers employers reaction to such activism, if they are on a fixed term duration, because her focus is on women workers in Cambodia, then it will not be renewed, the contract, or she will be outrightly fired or something like that. So, or in the family regime, that would mean that, particularly the husband will say, oh, you're devoting so much time in trade union work, you're not performing anymore your unpaid care work, etc., etc. So these dynamics now within these trade unions. I think the question there is, but okay, if this is the case, if there are tensions, a positive gain or a positive outcome or a gain in one regime may lead to an adverse impact or a penalty in another regime. And then, I think that is quite questionable, because it raises also the question that, like what Edlira said earlier, it's static, but we argue that it may be more dynamic, because I think what is missing is women's agency in the discussion, or the agency of trade unions, women's agency, for example, that women and trade unions, for example, can remediate, penalties in one regime as a result of gains in another regime. And we found ways in our study on how this may actually be addressed. Now, for example, women's activism in the gender regime in trade unions, for example, having a negative impact on the gender regime as far as the family is concerned. What the trade unions did, particularly the women leaders, is that, in every activity of the trade union, and this is also, of course, is supported by the trade union, is these are stories of women. They ask their husbands, to drive them to their workplace, to also attend the meetings, and for them to understand, the importance of their work. So something like that. Now, it's a simple things, and of course, in union activities, if funds are available, some family members, particularly the husband, are also, invited to join, something like that. So that could be in terms of the family, and of course, also what I said earlier in terms of addressing, the issue of care work. If this is the reason for women not to participate in trade union activities in the workplace, the remediation may be, of course, in the form of how the trade union itself engages with the employers. And here you can see it is a measure now of trade union strength, which means that trade unions must also organize and represent more women, which of course is also a strategy for a waning unionization rate in many unions all over the world. Okay, another one would be, for legal frameworks. Push for legal frameworks, trade union pushing for legal frameworks, which is, of course, again, a factor in our case study, or in our conceptual framework. Push for legal frameworks that, that prohibits arbitrary termination of employment or discrimination based on union membership. So these are just examples of ways on how, the gender regimes tensions Christy Ward raised can be addressed, or these are the remediations which unions can use, in terms of, the tensions between and among the gender regimes, in terms of gains and penalties between and among the three gender regimes.
Like to add short, a brief addition to the discussion. Like I was also there during the discussion, but I find it when there are actions, there are reactions. So there are backlash when women and trade unions push for gender equality policy. And it was also mentioned in the handbook. For example, one of the difficulty there was about the very controversial reproductive law in the Philippines. It was really bloody, not really bloody, but it was full of debate. And the law was just the law proposal took like 12 years, but the idea was just to give women information and the choice to decide what to do with their bodies. And that's the main idea of the law. But it had a very strong backlash from conservative and right-wing religious groups, really very strong, and it became very quite sometimes a little bit violent, and the words were really like telling women who advocate for reproductive rights as evil and satanic, because it rocked the boat of what women should be doing. And the same thing, when the trade unions supported that law, the trade unions were also among the evil axis, according to the right-wing religious groups. And that became, because there's a backlash in all actions, and that because it rocked the boat on the different regimes. And it will continue to be that when there is action, there is agency from women that proposes alternative structures in order to address structural inequalities, cultural biases, or discrimination in gender. And in the handbook, we try to be as flowing as possible, that trade unions can be more inclusive, trade unions can be more open in these new ideas in promoting gender equality. But also what's important is to integrate, like an example from, I think it was from the project on 4040, to integrate everything on gender equality on all aspects of the trade union and actions, like for example, a gender equality statement on an issue on gender should not come from the gender department, but should come from the leadership or executive office. It doesn't have to be separate from all the trade union actions, structures, and the trade union life.
Thank you very much. There is a question in the chat. I think we already spoke a little bit on about this, but I will read it. And then I see Michael with a question. So from, I hope I spell your name correctly, Ojidiran Kunle. Whenever we talk about gender inequality, we mostly focus on women being denied the opportunity to get involved in trade unionism. The question is, are women really interested in trade unionism, trade union struggle?
Minky.
They are, if given the opportunity. But of course, yeah, they are denied opportunities. But we are saying in our research that opportunities are hindered by structural, institutional, social, and cultural barriers. And there are barriers for women. We outlined it very specifically in the handbook. So if these barriers are mitigated or remediated, as Mel's term, then opportunities will broaden, and we will see that women will be interested in more, that there is more to life than being inside the house. Mel?
Women are also workers. And workers are, are the core of trade unionism. And historically, women fought side by side, struggled with men, in the course of history of the trade union movement, all over the world.
Thank you very much.
That would be my short answer.
Before I go to Michael, I would like to read some comments, like 2 comments in the chat. From Edlira, thank you, Melissa and Werner, and Dina Feller, amazing work, sisters. And Benjamin wrote, in the Philippines, among the most unionized sectors are majority women, like garments, and then private sector and education in the public sector. Thank you for that. Okay, please, Micah, go ahead with your question.
Good day, Prof. Melisa and Prof. Rina. I think my question is more on the practical side. For women in trade unions who would like to say initiate transformative change for gender equality in their organizations, in your study, was there an observable or glaring trend as to what strategies come first, or what strategies can jumpstart this process for transformative change? Was there a glaring observation? Did rules come first before spaces, or did rules come first before cultures changed? And I think, and following that, in the process of working for transformative change, should these organizers, or should those who advocate for this look out for, or were there also vulnerabilities or pitfalls in the process that may have been observed in your research? Was there any glaring challenges, or was there any particular barrier that really either put a halt to this transformative change or set the process back? So maybe just more practical questions.
I'll start, Mela, just briefly. Very nice question, very practical. We can never really determine which started, but based on my experience, it started from the women themselves. No, there was a mass movement and critical thinking among a group of women that studied together about rights of women, reproductive rights, non-discrimination, and then being conscious about the gender pay gap. And there were a lot of inequalities in terms of the share of the household and all that, and discrimination, and being considered as second-class citizens. And that started from women being conscious. However, inside the trade union, of course, when that started, it was very confrontational. And then there was resistance, and it was something new. And there was, of course, resistance. And there were a lot of barriers towards that, not only culture, social, but also structural. And that's normal because it was threatening all our beliefs. No, it was threatening the traditional belief that women should be like this, act like this, behave like this, but it was threatening. So it has a lot of resistance. And but then for the trade unions, through time, they were also exposed to different ideas externally and internally. And there was a lot of debates. And some trade unions have taken on the initiative. So for example, measuring how gender equal are they through gender gap analysis. So they're trying to ask, are we really gender sensitive trade union? Are we inclusive enough to women workers? Are we welcoming enough women workers? Why are women not joining us? So these questions started also from the trade unions. So there could be many movements or double movements from below, from external, from the top, and then it will be brewing. But we have proposed a practical way in the handbook at the end, and we've also mentioned some tools. So to to have a more practical recommendations, we have a cycle there, how to jumpstart. But it could be anywhere on that point. But if you want to find somewhere to jumpstart, there were some recommendations in the handbook.
Just a quick addition to what Verna said. I think the most important, the first step, because you're talking about ordering of strategies, which would come first, not the chicken or the egg or whatever. Anyway, I think what is important, the first step should be, the presence of a strong organization of women within the trade union. Women who are empowered, and they would lead, of course, the change, the initiatives. So that is why one leader of a global union federation, I think it was UNI, because of their 40 for 40 campaign, which was successful, is that she emphasized, building of sisterhood, among women, in the trade union. So yeah, I think that's the most important thing first to establish. And then the rest would come, in whatever order.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your questions and your answers. I just wanted to remind that Melisa uploaded the handbook right in like the first thing you can see in the chat. So because we spoke so often about the handbook, so there's a chance to read the whole handbook. If there is no further question, I would like to have the last one to finalize the conversation, the workshop. So last chance, if there's any other question. No? Okay, then I will go ahead. So one interesting element of the transformative strategies that you discussed in your video lecture are gender equality champions. You mentioned it before, Werner, which you describe as committed to making sure that they themselves, other officers and members complied with gender equality decision made at congresses, conference, and other key union events. Why do you think some men decide to become gender equality champions? What are the factors that facilitate these strategies? I think this is a good question also to give a positive outlook, that there is also solidarity of the side of the men. Thank you.
I'll start, Belle. You continue the response to the question. So very interesting. Why are there champions? But of course, this is not only about men. No? Champions, you can find champions male and female, or trans women, LGBTQ, but they are champions of gender equality. Why do they stand out? Because there is resistance. If there is no resistance, there will be no champions. But initially, at a strategy of finding them, it started from the political movement, of course. Where do you find people that will advance your cause? These could be influencers, decision makers, policy makers. But another question was why? But it's more about how are they developed? It takes a long time, and it's like your champions emerge when there is a lot of trouble, when there's a lot of resistance. They are like a metal. When you try to make a sword, they are developed through different factors. Could be influenced by their family. They have very strong women in the family. They are influenced by their education, by their culture. If they are part of a progressive organization, they believe really in the trade union movement as a gender equality instrument. They can be also the mass-based leaders, the organizers, the educators, and these are champions that emerge when there is difficulty. And as a strategy, usually we try to find them to be able to make a lot of to be able to influence and advance our causes. But on a practical level, really, because also champions, they somehow, when there is confrontations, they somehow mediate that. Because I've seen a lot when there's a group of very strong women, and then you have a very strong resistance from traditional males, they usually clash. And when you have nowhere to go, sometimes champions emerge to mediate that. Those are just my perspectives.
Melissa, do you want to add something?
I think a follow-up question is, what strategies facilitate? Is that
Sorry.
And
Yeah,
why men choose to be champions?
and choose? Okay. Well, perhaps we can ask Benji, why do you choose to become a champion of gender equality? Anyway. Well, yeah, like
are you?
I think in the last there is a section 5 of our handbook. We listed, how men gender equality champions are developed, over time. And this was called from a study that really looked into male, particularly men gender equality champions. And from our interviews as well, we found that men gender equality champions initially started as the young organizers in sectors where women dominate: garments, electronics, like what and services sector. So early on, they have internalized women's issues, women's struggles, etc. And then when they become leaders, they became gender equality champions. Another strategy would be, more on how the trade union treats women's issues. So one measure that facilitated, men taking up gender equality issues is to make gender equality a labor rights issue as well. So that was also dominant, that was also a much pronounced strategy that we encountered in our study. Also, like what Verna said, the various trainings, involving men in various trainings, more interactive trainings, role playing. So these are specific strategies in training, not just straight lecture, but more interactive role playing, so that men participating in these training activities will have an experience, exposed, will feel, how it, how to some extent, women's issues, the gravity of women's issues, etc., etc. And I think I cannot recall at the moment everything, but you can find them. So these are the things that may facilitate the development of men. And of course, also in many trade unions, the men leaders who are feminist, it can also be attributed to the fact that a number of them, are married or have partners, women and otherwise, who are feminist, for example, who are feminists. So we have one, for example, a trade union leader who is married to a feminist. So in a way, a relationship, having a relationship with a feminist person or a women rights advocate, also is a factor in developing men to become gender equality champions. So I mean, it's a host of factors again, so which of course several of which we have outlined in our handbook.